Have you ever felt like running tech in church means you're missing out on worship? I know I have. For years, I thought my job was simple. Show up, set up, and make sure nothing goes wrong. I considered it a win if I got through the service without any problems, but something began to shift. Hey, I'm Patrick Chambers and welcome to Divine Audio Solutions. I spent over a decade in church production running sound, lighting, visuals, and live streams. And for years, I felt like I was missing out on worship because I was caught up in making sure everything worked. Maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you're doing it all, and it can be a lot. Have you ever stood at the back of the room, watching everyone else enter into worship? You're stuck staring at a screen, turning knobs and adjusting levels. Maybe you've even wondered, am I really worshiping or am I just working? If you've ever felt like you're just there to push buttons, troubleshoot, or make sure things sound right, I get it, I've been there, but I want to challenge the way you see your role. Because church tech isn't just technical, it's ministry. And when you understand that, it changes everything. One of the toughest things about serving in church tech is how easily it can feel invisible. When everything runs smoothly, no one notices you're even there. But the moment something goes wrong, suddenly all eyes are on you. And when that's your weekly experience, only being noticed when there's a problem, it's easy for your passion to drift. Instead of focusing on worship, you can unintentionally misdirect it into a drive for perfectionism, trying to avoid any potential issues. And that's exactly what my services started to feel like. Each service became a constant firefight. No matter how early I arrived, there was always something to fix, cables to rerun, batteries to replace, sound issues to troubleshoot. My entire focus was on solving problems, not on encountering God. One Sunday is etched in my memory. The bare stage, the ticking clock, the buzz of faulty amps. The band was late. Instead of finding a moment to pray for peace, I was consumed by the technical fire. My mind raced, solutions blurring as I relied solely on my own efforts. In that moment, I felt entirely alone, cut off from divine guidance. I justified it by telling myself I'm making worship possible for everyone else. But deep down, I started to wonder, is this really worship for me? I didn't have some big dramatic moment where God spoke to me from the clouds. It was much more subtle. It started one Sunday morning when I was feeling particularly drained. I was nearing a breaking point. It's hard to step away even for a moment because everything will fall apart if you do. And then you start to feel guilty for even thinking about your own needs. And out of sheer desperation, I decided to try something different. Before I touched a single cable or fader, I took 5 minutes to pray. Not for the gear, not for a flawless mix, but for the people walking into that room. I prayed that they would encounter God, that worship would soften their hearts, that lives would be transformed. And immediately, something changed. It wasn't a huge emotional breakthrough. The stress didn't magically disappear, but something happened. I had more grace and patience with people. I was able to think more clearly rather than getting lost in the stress. I started seeing the bigger picture instead of just focusing on what was going wrong. It was like stepping back and seeing the whole picture rather than obsessing over the tiny details. At first, this wasn't easy. I had trained myself so much to focus on the tasks that I had to retrain myself to see what was actually happening in the room. I remember watching people in worship completely immersed in the presence of God. And at first, I felt jealous. I thought, why is it that I can see everyone having a moment with God, but I feel nothing? But over time, that jealousy turned into gratitude. Instead of thinking, why am I missing out? I started thinking, how incredible is it that I get to witness this? That I get to help create an environment where this can happen. That was the first major shift. That was the moment everything started to make sense again. It led me to a scripture. If church tech truly is a ministry, there has to be a biblical foundation. And it turns out there is. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. That means that work in production isn't just a job, it is an offering to God. And this isn't a new idea. When you look at scripture, you see worship has always involved people working behind the scenes. Consider the Levites, chosen to serve in the temple. They weren't just musicians, they were responsible for logistics, security, and preparation of worship. Some guarded the gates, took care of the sacred items, baked the bread, managed supplies. Their role was essential, but mostly unseen, much like a church tech team today. In 2 Chronicles 29:11, it says, my sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him and serve him, to minister before him and to burn incense. The Levites weren't just completing tasks. They were called to serve God through their work, just like the church tech teams today. It brings us back to the essential who behind the what. If you've been feeling lost in your role, if you've been asking yourself why you're doing this, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, who am I when I'm not behind the sound desk? That question is critical for you, your team, your family, and your church. In those moments, remember, you're not just a technician or a sound engineer or a volunteer. You are first and foremost a child of God. Like Mary who sat at Jesus' feet, it is vital to remember our being with him is more important than our doing. So how can you reflect that, your identity as his child, when serving in your ministry? For so long, my identity was wrapped up in what I did for God, not who I was with God. That realization hit hard. It left me confused, frustrated, even feeling a bit lost. But I knew I had to find my why. So I sat down and prayed, searching for my why. What was the point of all this? I started writing down whatever came to mind, hoping to stumble upon the answer. At first, my answers were shallow: to make a good mix, to avoid noise complaints, to make sure everything runs smoothly. But as I kept going, the words started to change, revealing a deeper purpose: to lead people in worship, to create an atmosphere that helps people encounter God, to reflect my identity as a child of God in everything I do, to let my service be an overflow of my personal worship. That was the shift. That was the moment everything started making sense again. If you've been feeling lost in your role, if you've been asking yourself why you're doing this, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, who am I when I'm not behind the sound desk? Because when you can answer that question, when you see that your identity isn't in what you do, but in who God says you are, that's when serving becomes an overflow of love, not an obligation. You're not just a tech, you're a worship leader. And when you serve with that mindset, everything changes. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to Divine Audio Solutions for more content like this. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it with them. Let's grow together in both excellence and worship. See you in the next one.